Um, so I'm Pammi Sinha, and I'm at the University of Leeds. And basically, I was just going to sort of talk about what I've done so far to date, um, rather than focusing on any one particular project. And hopefully, it will it'll show you what I've done so far. And uh, of course, hopefully, if anyone is interested in sort of working with me, it'd be lovely to sort of talk to people. Okay, so I'm just going to my work in this area really has started back in 2008, principally through work that I'd done um, for for uh, for projects. So my background is fashion design. So I trained as a fashion designer, um, and while I was finishing off my MA in fashion design, I had an opportunity to take on a PhD, which looked at the links between the design process and the marketplace. So I spent a lot of time looking at different companies' design processes in the UK. And on the back of that, I was asked to um, develop a small project for the Tanzania Gatsby Trust, which is part of the Sainsbury's Foundation. And they were looking at re-establishing the textiles factory for the industry within Tanzania. And they were looking at it from a systems perspective. So to get the farmers with cotton, the technology for developing the textiles, and then finally onto designers. So my part in that project was to look at how the market capabilities for local designers. So the reason why I'm talking about that is because it had quite a big impact on me, because while I was out there, I I got to see a lot of companies, lots of different local as well as the big EPZ, the export processing zone factories. And while I was there, the project coordinator said to me, there's one place that nobody's going to have a look at, but I think you should, because it would be, I think, as a designer, you'll find it very interesting. So she took me to the secondhand markets, and I've never experienced anything as big as that. So it got me thinking about the whole business of secondhand clothing, and how it's reused, and how and what happens to it basically when it's no longer wanted. So I had a PhD proposal accepted for looking at this idea of recycled fashion, which eventually looked into the notion of upcycling. And it was really looking at ways to incorporate local knowledge and local cultural kind of patterns into clothes that could be upcycled from secondhand, to make it much more more different, and hopefully more appealing. So on the basis of that PhD, it led to quite a variety of other areas of interest. And looking at upcycling was really the start of me. You can see that I've gradually become more involved in the idea of waste. So I currently have another PhD looking at again upcycling and remanufacture and zero waste management for fashion, using computer technology, so optimization models. I'm not from the computer end. I come in from the design end, and I'm working with an expert in optimization. So in the Leeds Business School. Because of the work that I'd done with upcycling and remanufacture, I was then invited to write a book about remanufactured fashion. And I'd also been to Tanzania to look at waste textiles management. So they all kind of came together really around about that period of time. And then subsequently, I've expanded and looked at it in other areas, and I'm very interested in the international aspects of waste management of textiles. And I've currently got um, a scholarship for another PhD looking at waste management, but this time in knitwear. And again, it's using craft elements, but looking at it from an industrial perspective. And there are industrial applications for unraveling of knitwear, but they tend to be very high-end knitwear. So really, that's in a nutshell. It's very potted, but I just thought I'd sort of talk you through all of that. So this was where my journey started really, and it was absolutely lovely going to see all the craft people looking at various different things that they do. So as well as looking at the big EPZ, big factories that dealt with the mass volumes of textile production, I also um, was in a very privileged position to see a lot of the craft manufacturers and the local designers, and they were talking about the struggles that they had, and it was easy to see that actually the local designers were really hammered basically from all ends. So not only was were there really cheap imports, but also the secondhand clothing, and the government that they were working within also were very highly taxed, so they were struggling to actually make products that were economically made sense for the local consumers. So having looked at those sort of areas, and because I'd been introduced into looking at the systems approach to trying to understand how to integrate this sector into the larger environment of selling. Markets have been a really interesting area for me as well to look at. So again, these are the secondhand clothing markets, and the different ways of selling of the textiles. And as I say, my interest really began when I wanted to understand what happened to the textiles. So understanding that the markets for secondhand were very uh, structured within the secondhand markets. We did go to some of the auctions and things, but at the end of the day, we did notice that there were piles of clothing that actually people weren't making use of, and really that was where the question as to what actually happens to the clothing when they're no longer used. So this is part of the PhD that I supervised very early on, looking at upcycling. And what we did was we went to a variety of different fashion designers, and we looked at what they did, what their processes were, and we tried to sort of get to understand what they were doing within the industry and how they were operating within the industry. So it's all qualitative work and lots of interviews and drawing out processes, and we were gradually becoming more interested in terms of how the the SMEs or the micro businesses who were upcycling, and it was really all about addressing the climate change, etc. How could that, and how did that marry with the large mass market volumes? And then and so that's how we entered and the realms of remanufacture. And one of the things that we understood from doing all the case studies was that, and which became apparent from the case study companies that worked with the large retailers. So, for instance, Junkie Styling or Good One, they couldn't really guarantee standardized product, which is what the retailers tended to look for, but were able to accept that they may not be standardized, entirely. But that, it became quite a hard argument for them, and also about market sensitivity. So one of the examples that from Good One was that when they sold in places like Topshop, when Topshop was on did a sales period, they also had to go into sales period, which meant that any profit was also kind of very, very highly cut. So all that they could guarantee really was a standard design, but because they weren't getting things in bulk, they weren't able to produce things in the same fabric. And so there's a level of understanding that the consumer needed in order to be able to engage fully with upcycling. So as I say, it brought me into the realms of remanufacture, and we put together a definition of remanufacture as opposed to upcycling, and that was built. So the main aspects of remanufacture is really about considering, and this was taken through other people who looked at remanufacture within industries like the car industry and the aerospace. So it clearly had to be changed ever so slightly, because the whole notion of fashion is changed. So where remanufacture is all about making and remaking it to the exact same specifications as as the previous product, or the original product, we clearly can't go with that, because then we're not in fashion. So we had to understand that there was a certain difference that would arrive. So we started looking at it from the perspective of quality, and that would be the main criteria, that the quality of of something redesigned and manufactured all over again would be at least equal to, if not better than the original. So we looked at the conventional designers, and then the remanufactured, and in this, most of our cases were built on the upcyclers, um, who had been able to sell in the large retail formats. So we were comparing the main points of difference, and we found that raw materials that we used was a big point of difference. How they carried out trend research was a big point of difference, because again, the raw materials for the conventional process are very different from that if you're upcycling, because you've already got materials there. The range strategy therefore becomes very different, and sample development also becomes very different because of the restrictions on the amount of fabric that you have if you are going to be upcycling. So I was also interested within there in terms of how we could look at remanufacture from, as I say, from a mass market or a high volume production process. And we were looking at things like the technologies that were out there. So seam separation through microwavable threads that were used for the fabrics, the stitching, and also pattern making. And whilst we didn't get too far with it in the first PhD, the second PhD, the optimization, is actually looking at pattern cutting and pattern development, and it's looking at it from an optimization, so cutting and packing approach, where we're looking at how shapes can be cut out of other shapes, and maximizing the amount of space that can be made use of from those shapes. So it's still, it's a PhD, and it's still got a way to go before it's finished. So we were looking at it really from, what we're looking at it in terms of designing is really in terms of thinking about disassembly, and how design can be made more appropriate for disassembly, for pattern engineering, maybe thinking in terms of how we train our students to focus on redesign, and not just simply design, but redesign, and the type of networks or communities that there are currently, and how can we make use of those for a wider spread in terms of knowledge and practice amongst the industry. So as part of my thinking on the systems process, again, we were looking at the type of networks and material flows that would be really advantageous for remanufacturing companies. So this was just a concept that we had in the book on remanufactured fashion. So what for the consumer, before it got to the consumer, what sort of networks would a remanufacturing company need to have? So where would they get their supply of materials from? So we'd seen that they needed the charity shops, especially if there were those micro companies, because they couldn't afford to buy in bulk. But as the bigger you get, the more bulk you have, so available. So it's feasible to do it on a mass market volume. Also laundries, because many charities won't launder the fabric. Many textile recyclers or textile collectors also won't do it. So it's left to the the user, or the next person in the chain, to decide whether or not to launder it, and very often the consumer will launder it before they start to make use of it. There may also be virgin, the unused textiles suppliers. Waste textile collectors also would be part of that. So this is what we think, or what we saw as being current for the whole business of remanufacture or upcycling. And to make it more mass market, these were sort of extra kind of people that we thought were really important. So government policies, and of course we know that there are a growing number of policies in terms of waste textiles that are already taking shape. More disassemblers, and again, this is an area that I think is yet to grow, but makes for an interesting area to think about, because it's often considered to be a very labor intensive and not very well paid sort of area, but given the growth of the circular economy and how it's becoming not only more important, but more feasible and more acceptable in in the government, in consumers' perception of product, it might be an area to actually consider as being a sector of its own, with skills of its own. For instance, the unraveling project, we discovered that one of the companies that my master's student visited actually had an unraveling machine, but couldn't use it because the only person that they had that could make use of that machine was off ill, and couldn't, there was nobody else on site that could make use of that machine, and to train somebody was actually very expensive, and for the amount of unraveling that that company itself was prepared to do, so it just lay there unused. So these are skills that aren't really considered highly enough, but I think as we become engaged with this idea of the circular economy and the practicalities of it, it seems like it's an area to me that is important to consider as a sector. So I just thought this is a picture of myself and my researcher in Tanzania on one of the dump, the only big dump landfill site that they have. This was at Puga Kinyamwezi at that time, and this is taken in 2013, 2014. So you can see that we were actually looking to ex excavate textiles from about a meter down just to see what we would get. So we did do that, and cleaned, sterilized it, the whole oven business, and then we brought it back to England, put it into the labs to see what fibers there were, and they were all intact, every single one of them, cotton, polyester, whatever. So it makes for an interesting discussion about mining the textiles. So not only can we consider making use of textiles that we already wear and share and upcycle and recycle, but we could actually look at this concept of mining to try and eradicate landfill sites and make them habitable for humans again, because we know that people do live in and around and sometimes on landfill sites, but they're quite dangerous places to inhabit. So all that interest here in Leeds, I looked at, I had a small project with a local social enterprise called Zero Waste Leeds. It's actually a community organisation, a community interest group. And we looked at one single, this was funded by the ESRC Impact Acceleration Account. So it's a tiny account. It was just shy of £5,000 for about 6 months. And we basically had this CIC plus the Leeds City Council, and what we did was we were looking at spreading the message to the public not to put their textiles waste into the black bin. But on the back of that, we did, fashion hacks, small seminars. We invited designers and the local community of people who were interested in textile waste. So we had people that were sellers, retailers of craft. We had tailors, repairers, designers, upcyclers, sellers of secondhand clothing. They all came. We gave them a Google map of what we thought was taking place. So we had, all the textile banks, the Leeds City Council textile banks, the charity textile banks, supermarkets, and then they said, well, can we put ourselves on there? So we, together we put together this Google map, and you can, this is just a slide, so it's not interactive, but when you share the slide, you'll be able to see where the link is. So we were able to put in where we had the sewing workshops, the alterations and repairs, etc. So because that gave us a really good, okay, it wasn't 100%, but we got quite a good sort of indication of the types of activities that were taking place. And this is another picture of me in Sri Lanka. Very depressing because it's no better and actually worse. than the 4 years ago. This is taken in 2020. So that's me there. And that's one of the workers in the landfill. So he very kindly took me out there and showed me around. And this is you know, the landfill isn't like this all the way around, but this was at its height. So if I'm 5'3", so if you imagine that there are at least three, maybe four of me, so you can imagine just how tall that is, and most of that was textiles. Like, given you know, in Sri Lanka, they are very keen on recycling. So what you see on the landfill is stuff that they cannot sell, or they haven't identified a market for, and waste textiles is a big area. So they haven't really, although they are very keen on circular economy and recycling, its own recycling is only done on industrial textile, you know, post-industry, not post-consumer textile waste. So if you and I had nowhere else to put the clothing, it would actually go in the dump. It has nowhere else to go. So understanding that you know, the market for waste, whether it's going to be upcycled, recycled, remanufactured, whatever, is to me, it's quite a fundamental thing. So this is my last slide, and I just wanted to sort of give you an overview of we went to Colombo and we interviewed again lots of people. So we interviewed the large companies that were making. We asked them what they did with their textiles, because the project that I did in Sri Lanka was really post-consumer textile waste, or trying to understand the markets there. But in order to understand the market, we needed to find out where the waste actually came from. And so we decided to include industry to just see where the link was between industry and consumer. And actually, we found that there's a lot more than we bargained for. So although industrial manufacturers, their waste textiles can be sent to recycling, but it's not always. It's either recycled or incinerated, depending on what technology there is. So for them to recycle, it doesn't get recycled in Sri Lanka. It has to be sent abroad, and very often it's to India. It can be to Europe. It can also go to China, depending on what fibers there are. Sometimes the retailers or the brands won't allow them to do that because their IP or patents won't allow them to. So it has to be incinerated. So it really depends on what the brands will allow them to do. If they're allowed to resell the excess stock, then if it's fabric, it's often, or even if it's clothes, it can be sold to the local agents, to become either projects for, you know, the local community projects, or it can be resold as secondhand clothing, or offcuts from the industry. So again, because they're all working in the export processing zones, there's all sorts of tax issues to be organised before it can go into the local market. So once it enters the local market, then it becomes used as any textile made into any kind of clothing or product, and then it finds its way, you know, through reselling, or donations, you know, to friends, families, or you know, the servants. Once it's been used, you know, it can be upcycled. Often it can be composted, so some people do actually put it into the ground to decompose. We also found, you know, we did uh, a survey, a quantitative survey of what people do with their waste, you know, things that they no longer want in terms of clothing. So these were the most common: donation, redesign, or compost. And equally, you know, roughly just under half were leaving it, you know, because the system is so, um, it's underfunded, so it's very ineffective. there's always lots of political upheaval, and obviously we know the recent upheavals in Sri Lanka wouldn't have helped this at all. But it's uh, collections aren't that regular, so often people just throw things on the open ground, or they may even resort to burning in open air. If it's lucky enough to actually be picked up by the trucks, it goes into landfill, and it can be incinerated. Often what the landfill people do is that they'll get to a certain level, and stuff will be incinerated. So they've got their own facilities to incinerate, and it'll be reconverted into energy in the same way that industry does it as well. But we all know that incineration is the better to do something than nothing, but it still produces an awful lot of gases that we don't really want, as well as the energy. So really, that's pretty much all that I wanted to sort of say about myself, really.